Good morning, my ambitious lore seeker. I apologize for waking you before the sun has risen, but as today begins your efforts in the fields, I wanted to give you a warning about the outer edges of my land. Unfortunately, I have not been able to tend to the gardens in my domain for some time now, and the plant life out there has become a tad wild. Especially as the borders of my territory were marked with a rather dangerous guardian of sorts. Do you recall when I first mentioned that you were quite lucky to have made your way here when we first talked? The main reason for that is the overgrown road you happen to take is the only possible way to my home right now. You see, to keep out annoying pests like wild beasts and greenskins, I carefully planted a grove of bloodsedges to form a protective barrier between myself and the outer world. What? You've never heard of a bloodsedge? Oh dear. Well, that just won't do. Here, I brought some eggs and sausage for breakfast. Let me tell you about why I entrust the safety of my land to the bloodsedge, and why it is imperative you pay attention while tending to the fields. Some time ago, I struggle to recall precisely when, I had set out on a journey across the border princes. Back in those days, I was little more than a poor adventurer, chasing odd rumors and mythical beasts, with nothing besides the clothes on my back and random tidbits of knowledge to guide me. As I'm sure you're aware, the border princes are notorious for having a truly absurd amount of dangers, but well worth the risk for those with a bit of luck on their side. In fact, that very same adventure would conclude with me discovering my first grimoire. A tale for another time, perhaps. In any event, one of the main challenges any traveler must eventually face, especially in the eastern border princes, is the truly astounding amount of greenskins roaming around. Unfortunately for me, the usual tactic of moving unnoticed was proving quite difficult, as that accursed terrain offered little in the way of cover. Already suffering from an unforgiving sun and precious little food at my disposal, things escalated when I heard the chilling howl from a pack of wolves. Terror gripped me as I whirled around to see at least 24 goblin wolf riders bearing down on me from a cliff face only a few hundred meters away. I had little experience in combat at that time, and my chances of survival seemed virtually non-existent. You see, I hadn't developed my failsafe policy yet. Despite the panic coursing through my veins, I had enough presence of mind to desperately search for some escape from my impending doom. The only possible option I could identify was a meager thicket of trees just down a scree slope from the path I currently stood upon. Assuming I managed not to slip to my death in the descent, I could at least use the terrain to give myself a blind shot at survival. Without further delay, I threw myself over the edge, spending precious adrenaline to tear down the cliff face with a madman's hope of keeping steady. Despite a few close calls where the pebbles shifted ominously beneath my thundering feet, I miraculously stumbled to the safety of solid earth before finally losing balance and spilling out across the waiting rocks. While I may have been bruised and bloody, at the very least, no bones were broken, and I spared a glance above from my pursuers. Sure enough, before I even had a moment to breathe, the giant wolves came vaulting over the edge with all the grace one would expect of lean hunters. I will never forget tears of frustration spilling down my cheeks as despair welled up in my mind. Still, if my destined fate was to end up as wolf food, I intended to make them work for it. That bleak thought filled me with determination, and I sprinted towards the waiting trees. When I focused my attention upon the thicket ahead to identify where my best place for a last stand might be, I finally noticed what exactly stood before me. Skidding to a stop to ensure I had not simply lost my mind, there was no doubt that the branches and vines of these trees were reaching for me. It would have been difficult to notice such subtle movements, if not for the fact that the valley I had hurled myself into was devoid of wind. Yet every plant in that grove stretched for me, with all the desperation of two separated lovers reuniting on a winter's eve. It finally hit me, and a plan rapidly formed that I needed to act on immediately if it were to have any chance of success. Without hesitation, I tore off in a wide arc around the copse, limping heavily in hopes of it giving my foes the impression that I feared to risk tripping upon a snagging root. Sure enough, the goblins let out excited whoops and tore straight towards me without any regard for the trees. As the entire pack loped past the border of the grove, the bloodsedges lashed out in a frenzy of grasping branches and entangling vines. Each of the wolf riders found themselves suddenly ensnared, the greenskins crying out in alarm as their mounts thrashed with enraged snarls. With disturbing efficiency, each of the animated plants swiftly immobilized their prey, and proceeded to drag the raiders deeper into the small forest. Finally, every wolf and goblin were held against a bloodsedge's trunk, which resulted in a distinct sizzling sound before their screams of agony began. You see, the bloodsedge secretes an incredibly potent, sticky acid from their bark that is remarkably effective for dissolving any material. Flesh, clothing, fur, even armor. Nothing will hold out for long. And let me tell you, it is a miserably painful and slow way to die. To be carefully digested from the outside in, as the predatory tree breaks down its quarry into fertilizer. Although it varies from tree to tree, most bloodsedges will take roughly half an hour before most man-sized prey will finally succumb to their wounds. The giant wolves and their riders struggled for 20 minutes by my count, before their thrashing finally ceased. It took well over an hour for the bloodsedges to completely digest their meals, before returning to the calm illusion of normal trees swaying from a gentle breeze. Since that fortunate day, I have learned much about the bloodsedge. For instance, I learned how to grow these dreadful trees myself, For while one could go through the dangerous task of transplanting a sapling to a new location and hope it bears offspring, I find it is much simpler to just make new ones. You see, my dear student, most trees can be converted, so to speak, by glutting them on a diet of freshly spilt blood and continuous death. Hanging trees, for instance, have a nasty habit of twisting into a bloodsedge, which can be quite the ugly surprise for those who have come to rely upon it for their executions. I planted many groves to form a living wall around my territory, with the exception of the path you happened upon, and fed those trees with a steady supply of beastmen, until at last the violence, suffering, and bloodshed did their humble work. So now you know what awaits you outside. I will share with you how to stay alive when dealing with these frenzied creations, however. The most important piece is detection. Bloodsedges are not truly sentient things, more akin to other predatory plants that simply react when they detect even the potential of prey. As such, simply tossing something suitably large within their grasp or watching tree branches for unnatural movement will give away which trees are dangerous. Furthermore, should you have the misfortune of facing off with a bloodsedge, your best bet is, of course, fire. The sticky acid they produce is quite flammable, and any sufficient strike that reaches past their bark will cause them to ignite in a few short seconds. If you somehow find yourself entangled, and without any flame to bear, the best hope you have is to be nimble or strong enough to break free of their hold as quickly as you can. The longer it takes, the more branches and vines will wrap around your body and try to pull you in. Lastly, if you witness someone else plucked from their feet instead, the trunk of a bloodsedge is no tougher than any mundane tree, and will collapse before a few determined axe swings. That should be enough to guide your efforts, I think. The sun should be rising soon, and you'll be free to begin your work. Do be sure to harvest the vegetables and fruit trees. We can ensure a good week's worth of meals if my calculations are correct. It has been too long since I've been able to cook anything more complex than a simple stew. I have not been out in the garden for quite some time, so the bloodsedges may well have expanded beyond their intended plots. Be a dear, and if you find any growing outside of the botanical wall, to remove them accordingly. I am sure you will have little issue avoiding the grisly end of becoming bloody, steaming mulch. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this episode of the Monstrous Arcanum featuring the Bloodsedge. I hope you all are enjoying the series thus far, and are looking forward to the many monsters and creatures we have yet to cover. The next one I've seen requested in quite a few comments. As a quick heads up, during the last livestream and speaking to a few folks in the community, it seems that a rather concerningly substantial amount of people are not getting notifications about new videos being uploaded on the channel for some reason. To give yourself the best shot at knowing when a new episode of anything releases, hit the subscribe button and be sure you have that notification bell set to all notifications, for this channel at least. I also make sure to always post new episodes out on Discord and Twitter, so you can try using those to make sure you know when these things are coming out. In any event, thanks of course to all my legendary, beauteous patrons for their continued support. I'd also like to give a special shout out to the Mad Lads, Sign of the Emperor, Eric, CJ Ubusta, Charles Bode, Wendell Short Eyes, Jeffrey Ramers, and Higgins the Seagull. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.